Well, the Sacramento Kings are a total disaster right now, to the point where I don't think they can even come close to waiting until the trade deadline to try and save and patch the holes of this sinking ship.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Adam Armbrecht from the Locked On Nets podcast is probably sick of doing these with me because over the last 2 years, we did a podcast like this where I was trying to get Mikal Bridges to come to the Sacramento Kings. Well, the New York Knicks decided F you and your dreams, Matt. So now here we are, the Kings going back to the negotiation table here in this hypothetical scenario with the Brooklyn Nets because they have something else or maybe some things else that the Sacramento Kings could be interested in. We're talking about Cam Johnson and potentially Dorian Finney-Smith too. We're going to focus on Cam Johnson here. A hypothetical Kings-Nets trade conversation that may not be that hypothetical, Adam, because I think the Sacramento Kings are very interested in Cam Johnson. The question is, do they have the assets to legitimately get a trade done? First and foremost, we've heard all these rumors, all this speculation about Cam Johnson specifically being available. Do you expect him to be gone, right, by the trade deadline?
Oh, yeah. I mean, 100%. And it's been a little bit of a value here, having moved Dennis Schroeder to the Golden State Warriors. And you can go and look what his, plus minus looks like over there. So certainly got value in that move. But once they took him out of the equation, it's really brought this offense for the Brooklyn Nets down while still having Cam Johnson play at a high level, knock down his three-pointers, be pretty, successful on ball. We've seen his game expand a little bit this year as opposed to last season where we hoped that it would. And the Nets with Mikal Bridges could have been a different team with some different aspirations. But yes, I expect him to be traded. There's a little bit less pressure here now for Brooklyn in terms of the wins and losses equation because they're a bad team now. They're getting back to what we thought they were going to be coming into the year. And you couple that with a lot of suitors coming to the table about Cam Johnson. I think that Sean Marks and the Nets can afford to be, within reason, patient and see which teams are really going to push that extra asset, extra draft pick, extra player into the pot to get him.
See, that patience is what I think works against the Sacramento Kings in this conversation. And Adam, just so you're aware, the perspective that I've had with this Kings team right now, with how this season is quite literally in a tailspin for Sacramento early on, it's you've got to make a move. You can't wait till the trade deadline to do it. If you have to make the best offer, overpay to make sure you are making the best offer to get a team like the Brooklyn Nets to accept a deal this far ahead of the trade deadline, you probably have to do it. And I've heard rumors and whispers of conversations between the Kings and the Nets that have already been happening around Cam Johnson. And maybe the sticking point is the Nets are looking for a couple of first-round picks, not just a first-round pick in this deal. There might be some hesitancy from the Sacramento Kings. I'm to the point where if the Kings feel that Cam Johnson can help save their season, not that he's going to do it by himself, but help save the Kings season and give this Kings team what they desperately need, I'm paying 2 first-round picks plus the matching salary to get the deal done. Do you think that's like, if it was 2 first-rounders and matching salary, the Nets would say, okay, let's get it done before the deadline?
Yeah, I mean, that's the conversation for sure, right? So, you go through the trade machine stuff. I'm sure there's specifics of who you want to include or not. We've heard, Herter makes a lot of sense because the money is big enough and 2 years left. That works for Brooklyn next season. Okay, they're going to occupy some money to get to the salary floor. They're going to have Ben Simmons' $40 million contract coming off. Not going to have a lot of money on the books. And then you throw in maybe someone. This is a hard one for me because the Carter piece, and we'll get into that, he gets thrown into this equation too. And I think, so it's good to hear you say Devin Carter being added into this and the 2 first-round picks, because my curiosity was, are the Kings going to try to represent Carter as a first-round pick, drafted 13th overall? We get that, but if we'll get into my opinion on him and how the Nets would look at that, I think that those 2 players, if that's the conversation, and 2 first-round picks is still going to be the conversation for Brooklyn.
My gut feeling on the situation is that Devin Carter shouldn't be a deal breaker. We're talking about a guy who's never played a second in the NBA. However, I do know the Sacramento Kings are, of course, high on Devin Carter. They drafted him and we're hoping, Adam, we're begging, like just common sense begging that the Sacramento Kings knew of his ailment and knew that he wasn't going to play for months and still decided to draft him, even though the Kings are in a win now mode and need depth and need help. Just add it to the list.
By the way, just a quick aside here. Like I'm having a chuckle here. I know that you do a great job representing the fan base, the reality of the Kings and what's gone on, the hopes and dreams. But no, there's very few other franchises that have had elevated expectations to whatever degree and seen them not be achieved in the same way that the Brooklyn Nets have. So this is very much, simpatico, two brothers cut from the same cloth when we talk about things like this.
And when trying to make sense of the Devin Carter pick, it makes sense. Hey, maybe the Kings took another guard because they didn't expect Kevin Huerter to be here to start the season. Or maybe, just maybe, they took Devin Carter as a potential contingency plan if De'Aaron Fox decided to say bon voyage, even though he has a year left. So yeah, that makes it interesting, potentially including him in a deal like this. However, if you're going out and getting Cam Johnson, you're hoping that he can come in and help fix De'Aaron Fox's team as it stands right now. So I don't think Devin Carter would be a deal breaker. I do think the Sacramento Kings would try to avoid that. So if the deal flat out, let's say to start, is the Kings know it's going to take 2 firsts to get it done. If it's Kevin Huerter and 2 firsts, which financially works, you think the Nets push for more?
Probably. Or if they're not pushing for more, they're just saying, we're going to wait and see who else is making offers here. And there's reasons for that. So the Devin Carter piece is important to bring up for the fact that the Kings may not want to include him. I don't even think that the Nets really want him. Because when you look at the Brooklyn Nets right now, you mentioned it. Listen, Carter was known as a more defensive value player. And then he has this last collegiate year. He starts to show some offensive side to his game. He's going to be a two-way player. That's great. The Brooklyn Nets right now have Keon Johnson, who's the same age as Devin Carter. He's a former first-round pick, right? Pedigree. So if you're the Brooklyn Nets and you're thinking about a little undersized, playing Carter at the 2, we've already got Cam Thomas. There's a lot of things inside of this backcourt that I don't think getting Carter, who I look at, kind of to your point, as being a long-term, not long-term, but a developmental prospect that I would argue was taken too high. And now if you think about it relative to the upcoming draft class, I would say, where would you take him? I think he's probably closer to a back-end first-round prospect that you might grab. So that doesn't move the needle for Brooklyn. And if you're at the point of saying Huerter plus 2 picks, I think the conversation is being had, but I can guarantee you and paint a picture of a couple of other teams that would be in the mix here that have maybe the young player to throw in that the Nets would want to have and would want to take a look at developing.
And again, the idea of this trade is for the Sacramento Kings to try and put together an offer that makes the Nets feel good enough to where they don't want to wait and field other offers, because Cam Johnson is going to have suitors, like you talked about. He already does have suitors. So the Kings need to keep that in mind in this hypothetical scenario. That's why intentionally, Locked On Kings listeners, in this conversation, I'm having to and trying to overpay to make it realistic. That's why 2 firsts are on the board initially too. Kevin Huerter has to go for financial purposes. Plus, I think the Kings have been shopping Kevin Huerter for a while. This addition might make Kings fans start screaming at me, but I think it's a legitimate thing to talk about. What if it's Keon Ellis? What if it's Keon Ellis, Kevin, and the 2 firsts? Now, I think this is a significant overpay for the Sacramento Kings in this scenario. But again, if the Kings feel like we have to do something, we need to get this deal done today. Does that move the needle to a point where it's like, how can the Nets expect to get better than that?
Yeah. This is a different conversation, right? And we know that this is different than saying Carter and what he could be. 24 years old for Keon Ellis, just has more experience, has more value. And I think if you're the Brooklyn Nets, you look at him and say, okay, if we bring him in, and especially with by the way, any of these trades, I think that the Nets, because they have potentially 4 first-round picks next year, they're thinking about, how do we get a body in the door that means 2 things? 1, give me the runway the rest of this season to see how these pieces fit together. And then also guarantee. So in the case of Ellis, the Brooklyn Nets know that they could turn him into something else down the road. he has value. I don't think Carter offers that same value going. I mean, we know he doesn't offer the same value going forward in future trades. So there is this reality of the Nets having a log jam of young players and young talent. As long as they can be moved, then that's different, right? So the Nets say 2 first-round picks, Herter and Ellis, and now you go, great. Maybe it's not this year, maybe it's next year. We can turn him into another draft pick down the road. That does change and move the needle here for sure. Do I think it would get the deal done, today? They call today and make that offer. That's really interesting. And you're probably getting into the how close are we? What's another player we like more, or an extra pick here or there that another team might have to come to the table with. But that's, if you're the Kings and you want to come in with the offer that makes the Nets go, maybe we pull the trigger right now. It's not the Carter one. It's going to be one like this with Ellis and multiple first and matching salary.
It's kind of a side note.
Sure.
How much do you think protections on these picks matter? Because I think the Kings are going to want to have some kind of contingency plan. We're talking about picks that are probably, I mean, they still have their 2025 pick tied up in the Kevin Herter trade with the Atlanta Hawks. Believe it or not, that pick still hasn't conveyed, and with how the Kings are playing, still may not convey, and then turn into 2 second rounders the following couple of seasons. So we're talking about probably a 2027 first and a 2029 first or something along these lines. How much do you think protections, and we're not going to get too deep in the weeds here, but if the Kings were trying to get, let's say, the earliest pick based off their trajectory, they're trying to get that lottery protected, or they're trying to get a top 10 protected or something like that. Do you think that scares off the Nets at all, or do they know if they're getting 2 first, there's going to be some protections on these bad boys?
Yeah, I mean, there's some version of it where one of them is, right to swap. So you just know that you get the better, right? Nets get the better. So, okay, you guys spiked the wrong way and you end up the top of the lottery. Our pick, sorry, your loss. I don't think those protections matter in a big way in this conversation. We talked about this the other day when it came to the Golden State Warriors and the Dennis Schroeder trade, and saying one of the funny things, as you mentioned, we got this pick from the Herter trade. It's tied up with all these caveats. When you're a team like the Kings, as the example, I feel like you should be more capable and willing to give up your own picks that you control solely, because in theory, you believe you're going to improve your team, build, get better, and compete. As opposed to, as the Brooklyn Nets, when you're holding other teams' tickets a lot, and they did a lot of work this past off season with McHale and that trade to get back control of their own picks, you're dancing this line of how bad are they going to be, right? You're trying to watch other teams stock a little bit. So I think that makes it a little bit easier. Whether or not lottery protected would be fine, or if it was, say, top 10, or if it's, top 4, something in those ranges, I don't think in any of these discussions it's going to be too difficult. The only caveat I would give on a higher level is that if other teams are offering, and this is as the example, if you tell me the Detroit Pistons pick, 2 years from now, unprotected, some other team controls, well, Detroit's always a team that you feel like good chance we're going to be near the top, right? So that might be the only part where you feel like you can get something a little bit stronger from another place.
So let's get a little bit greedy now from the Sacramento Kings perspective, because there's another name on this roster that the Kings are also interested in, Dorian Finney-Smith. And I think that a lot of people look at this player as a consolation prize. If you can't get Cam Johnson, you can get Dorian Finney-Smith probably for significantly cheaper. It's not going to cost you 2 first-round picks. Does Dorian Finney-Smith move the needle for the Kings as much as Cam Johnson does? No, although DFS would, I think, drastically help the Sacramento Kings with just the fact that they have 0 depth other than Keegan Murray at Finney-Smith's position, and someone that can actually guard the perimeter and stay in front of their man. But the greed here is, can the Kings get both? And when you start to try and make the dollar figures work in a deal like this, it gets really tricky for Sacramento, because this is where you start to run out of pieces that you have to financially move in this deal that you want to move. The 2 first names that Kings fans are going to start screaming is Kevin Herter and Trey Lyles. Okay, but you're like $13 million under budget here. Throw in Devin Carter. Doesn't work. Now you have to add another player on top of that. You're talking about a 4-player for 2-player swap. You just don't see this much in the NBA. So now you have to start talking about adding in a Keegan Murray, which the Kings would absolutely not do, but financially they might need to do to make a trade like this work. Financially, this trade is very, very difficult to pull off. Instead of getting too deep into those weeds, I'll just ask this question. A package that gets both Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith. One, do you think that's realistic that the Nets would trade both in the same deal? And two, how much more in your mind are we talking a team needs to bring to the table to close an offer or close a deal like that?
Yeah, high level, no. I don't think there's a package that gets both into the Kings or to any one team, because the value individually in trades is always going to be better and stronger. Because the second you talk Cam Johnson and what it take to get him, okay, great. There's the assets. There's the salary match. Well, now we also want DFS, but we don't have any more assets really, at the same value, or we don't have the players. And then great, let's talk about some of your best players, right? Let's start sending us some of your best guys. So I think it'd be really hard to pull off a deal like that. The value of Dorian Finney-Smith to me, we keep hearing these things. We've heard this for the last couple of seasons with him.
Sure.
Brooklyn Nets are putting a first-round price tag on him. Now, by the way, if you're a contending team and it's back end of the first round, that is different, right? Than maybe something that's going to fall closer to the middle. If you're the Kings and you're looking at the Western Conference, that first-round pick you give could still end up being closer to the middle than the back end. Realistically, I think it's not too dissimilar necessarily, although the market for these guys is scarce. Like Cam Johnson and then Dorian Finney-Smith are two of the better. Cam Johnson's the best target, I think, for teams to look at. Dorian Finney-Smith is a very strong target right now. But the way that Dennis Schroeder went for effectively a couple of seconds, and then maybe looking at, now give me a player of talent, a young player that can be developed, I think that might be where the package ends up. So can the Kings put together an extra 2 second-round picks and a young prospect? I feel like we end up circling back to like the Devin Carter and saying, well, what about Devin Carter? I just don't know if we need that. So hard to make this double deal done. Although I have a different angle that I think Kings fans and you should maybe be looking at when it comes to trade packages to make with the Brooklyn Nets.
Hit me.
So I don't think Cam Johnson's going to end up being a King. I don't think the assets line up. I don't think the players, I think there's going to be better deals ultimately. And I think the Nets, Sean Marks has been notoriously patient. There's been years when he's been over patient and then not moved players. It's why Dorian Finney-Smith is still here. So you tell me real quick here, when I see that if I have this correct, Kings are 10th in points per game. They're 23rd in 3-point shooting percentage, and they're 18th in rebounds right now. So if you look at this roster and you hear some of the rumors around the Brooklyn Nets, Dorian Finney-Smith is definitely getting moved. Day'Ron Sharpe is another name that's getting put out there right now. If I'm the Kings, because you're 13 and 17, and I just don't, this is always the worst, I'm sure you would say. I think it's bad business to trade for Cam Johnson and think that that's going to make your team a contender. It's not. He's a great player, but your team seems a little bit broken here in some ways. The hedge trade for me would be Dorian Finney-Smith, who's crushing it from beyond the arc, shooting an incredibly high volume. His ratio of 2-point to 3-point shots in terms of his overall shot selection is heavily weighted in the 3-point shooting. He also, while not being as athletic as a Cam Johnson or positionally versatile, he gives you real defensive value on the perimeter. You can match him up with a lot of guys. There's games this season, even against Giannis, where he was able to hold up defensively. That combined with saying, what do you want for a Day'Ron Sharpe to help improve? He's just a rebound getter. That's almost his sole function. That to me is more interesting. You get 2-to-1 value on your players. The salary match isn't as much. You can move on. There's a player option for Dorian Finney-Smith. He'll probably pick up potentially at $15 million next year. Like, there's a lot of nice things there to me where it's a low value risk to try to jumpstart your season back in the right direction.
So quick context question to this, because I think ESPN is doing Day'Ron Sharpe dirty. And multiple places I see Day'Ron Sharpe listed at 6'11". ESPN has him listed as 6'9". He's 6'11", right? Or is he in between the two?
I'll split the difference and say like he's probably 6'10", but he's a big guy, right? So he's physically capable of those matchups and those things, especially around the basket.
This is what these negotiations have come to. I'm now bleeding to try and get this trade done. Adam Armbrecht, nice enough to deal with me having to run away because my nose just started gushing blood on this Christmas Eve when I'm not trying to bludgeon you.
I'm not trying to beat you up in these negotiations, but I got to get a good deal.
Adam said that Cam Johnson probably wasn't going to be a King, and my body physically started bleeding and reacting. I don't know if that's trying to get sympathy or just the fact that this is symbolic of the Kings season. The Kings are literally bleeding and begging for help. We were talking about Day'Ron Sharpe and a Dorian Finney-Smith deal beforehand, and what I asked you is about him, whether he's listed at 6'11" or 6'9". The reason why I asked that question is because the Sacramento Kings are they're undersized at every single position. They're just undersized. So the idea of adding players that are undersized at their position is a little bit spooky to Sacramento. That being said, I think Day'Ron Sharpe would absolutely help the Kings, especially if he's coming in with a Dorian Finney-Smith deal, would help the Kings. I don't think this is a bad, again, consolation prize sounds disrespectful. I think this does, depending upon what the Kings move, address needs. I won't say make the team better because we don't really know, but address some needs. But it's a single to settle for instead of the solid, probably triple that the Kings could try and land in a Cam Johnson trade. So even if you think that Cam Johnson won't try and be a King, that's what the Kings are ultimately going to try and do. And maybe that's the reason why we haven't even gotten a deal to this point, because I know for a fact the Kings have already made calls about Cam Johnson. And of course, here we are.
And I think maybe the other part of it is too, I wonder if, so, when we go back to, and that's why I bring it up. I mean, one, because from a Nets perspective, we know, first of all, Dorian Finney-Smith, there's a good chance he may pick up that player option next year. We prefer probably not to have that here. Day'Ron Sharpe is up for a contract extension. The Nets didn't make that happen. So there's this ambiguity around what will happen with him this offseason. So there's reasons to try to get value now before maybe it runs out. But to go back to the Cam Johnson of it all, when you mention a player like Ellis, and I think the Nets would be very interested in that, but who else on this roster do you think the Kings are capable of and willing to move somewhere else and then say, well, here's what we got is the extra first-round pick, right? Because I think that there's some part of that might be the deal sweetener, where I don't know if Sean Mark's done a good job with this, but do we want to get into the secondary leg of where's the third team that we bypass somebody through? If the Kings can front end figure out a way to get more to Brooklyn, maybe make that precursor trade and then open it up to the third team, making Brooklyn that third squad. That I find interesting too. It's like, how do the Kings bolster what they can put on the table here? And I think if we saw something like that from the Kings, a trade that wasn't with the Brooklyn Nets, it would almost be well, hold on now. What were the exchanges? What are the players? And do those look good for Brooklyn potentially?
Hey, take your pick of Doug McDermott or Jay Crowder, huh? Can I interest you in Orlando Robinson? No? Oh, well, darn
Come on now. Come on.
This is an issue that the Kings are going to run into, is because they want to try and keep their core intact. They don't want to trade any of their core in this deal. But once you get outside of the core, it's like, how desirable pieces do you really want? That's why the Kings are hoping that the draft picks probably in this scenario are that desirable piece that I think the Kings are banking on. Hey, no other team is going to give you 2 first rounders for Cam Johnson, Nets. So take this deal. And I don't know. I don't think that gets the deal done before the deadline day.
So there's a couple of things. Yeah, there's a couple other things here, because now I always like to find a way to spin it. I'm making the deal to get this job done. But look, I've heard things like, you hear the Thunder. Well, they have Wiggins, they have Topic, they got a 2026 floating around there. Those are young players that might have value the Nets would associate differently. Heard about the Grizzlies. I talked with Joe the other day. We were just going back and forth a little bit, and I had asked, because we were curious about Nicholas Claxton and where the contract is, and if maybe the Nets would be open if teams called about him. He rejected that, but said, hey, if you tell me it's Cam Johnson, you can throw the extra first-round pick in. So at least from a Locked On Nets network perspective, the Grizzlies are in those waters of, we would give you 2 first-round picks, Marcus Smart's contract, and something else, right? So already competing there a little bit. And then you can go into like teams like the Spurs or even the Magic, who have some backcourt players that might make sense in the short term for Brooklyn. So there's some other teams there. But my curiosity would be, well, one, where did the Kings value Ellis? When they think about any of these deals? Because actually, hold on, point stop. Do you think that the Kings should be trying to make this trade? Because I see a 13-17 team in the Western Conference that seems to be a bit disjointed, and I feel like the Kings might be on the precipice of throwing away assets for a goal that they're not going to achieve in this iteration. That would be my concern if I'm a Kings fan right now.
So the reason why I say yes is because I think this is the least daunting option ahead of them. That, I mean, it borderlines on desperation, because if you can't find a way to fix this roster as is, that should absolutely be better than 13-17 at this point. There's something inherently wrong. Now you have to start talking about jobs. Now you have to start talking about Mike Brown being fired, or going even a step above that, looking at the front office and going, Monty McNair needs to get fired because he can't close out a deal, right? This Cam Johnson trade is a realistic, in my opinion, scenario of how the Kings can go out and get what this roster needs and give this core one last shot at turning into something and believing in it before you just blow the hell up.
I will note too that you guys are, I think, you're a plus 1.2 point differential. So, that's always you look at that number and you go, well, something doesn't add up here. There has to be some run bad luck in these games. I'm sure injuries, you could point to, as every team can, a handful of different things where you say, maybe we're really close to a 500 team right now. And then that does look different, right? 2 wins going the other way. You're a 500 ball club and you're saying, okay, so it hasn't gone quite as well as we hoped. And if we add this piece in, does it change it? So I'm sure fans would look at it this way from a Kings perspective of, let's not let the record fool us. We do think we're better than what the record says. So we view ourselves as being still that top 5-ish, 6-ish kind of seed in the Western Conference and trying to move up the board.
So let's wrap up with this, because I don't think this makes too much sense for the Brooklyn Nets, but it's topical because Rich Paul has been in Sacramento, and De'Aaron Fox's future is starting to be in question. We heard teams like San Antonio are starting to posture and put themselves potentially in a position to go out and make a run for De'Aaron Fox if the Fox era is indeed coming to an end in Sacramento. You have the Houston Rockets, which makes a ton of sense. Houston is his hometown, plus the Rockets have assets. But because I got you here, Jordi Fernandez is the head coach of the Brooklyn Nets. We love Jordi here in Sacramento, and clearly Jordi's absence is being felt here in Sacramento this season. I know De'Aaron Fox really loved Jordi Fernandez too. Do you think there's any interest whatsoever from the Brooklyn Nets in going out and suddenly making a swing for a superstar like De'Aaron Fox and making him the cornerstone of the Nets going forward?
In this season, no. 100% no. I think if they weren't making these trades, and Schroeder doesn't have to be included in it, but, Cam Johnson's on a contract. So you can debate whether it's good or bad, but he's here long term. If you're trading some of these guys, these are the guys for the exact reason the Kings are calling, right? These are the guys you would want to have there with Fox. So I would find it really hard to go to this offseason, let's say, all the speculation's out there, they can't get the contract extension, they're going to move them, and have the Nets dive in on that, because in theory, they're going to have that top 4 draft pick, right? They finally are going to have control of organizing their future. Now, how that draft shakes out and where their pieces fit in, if Fox is still there in Sacramento going towards the deadline next season, and it doesn't look like things are going well for the Kings, that's a different conversation. Because maybe, I tell you one thing, man, Jordi Fernandez, for the first time in 4 years, has reminded the Brooklyn Nets fan base about what coaching looks like and about the impact of coaching, the value of coaching. It's why the Nets fan base has been ripping their hair out on this idea of how are we winning these games? Why are we winning these games? It's because Fernandez has come in and installed a system, and that effort piece, which seems so silly to talk about, but he has drawn such a hard line in post games. When he doesn't see the effort on the court, he has flat out said, if I don't see it, you're not playing. And the full confidence of the organization to set that new tempo and that new standard has been given to Jordi in full. So it really is much different to think about how you get the most out of players and value. So not this year, maybe not in the offseason. I think next trade deadline, depending on where Brooklyn looks and if they spike Cooper Flag, well, that's the same thing you mentioned the Spurs. That's what they're talking about. We got Wemby. Let's pair him with a veteran, high talent guy. That's when the conversation changes, but you need to have that guy first, right? You need to know that you have that young superstar talent before you worry about sending out assets and bringing in players.
All right, let's put a bow on this conversation. Kings fans, if I were to say the offer is to try and get the Nets to say yes today or tomorrow or before the new year, well before the trade deadline, the offer is Kevin Huerter, Keon Ellis, and 2 future first-round picks for Cam Johnson. Adam, you think the Nets would really, really, really strongly consider saying yes to that this early?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Kings fans, are you freaking out about that? And I think a lot of people would because of the Keon Ellis element. But look, this is the reality to the situation. I like Keon Ellis a lot too. We're talking about a player that just last year was on a 2-way contract being included to go out and get a guy. You don't make this trade, like Adam was talking about a little earlier. You don't make this trade if you think Cam Johnson is only going to help a little bit. If you think Cam Johnson is going to be a significant difference maker and the kind of the last piece missing of this core, if you think that is it, then you include Keon Ellis and 2 firsts. You do it. If you don't, then you don't make that trade. But let's say the Kings do believe it, and this is the way that they can get the deal done. Kings fans, how do you feel about that package? And then I'll throw it one more time to you, Adam. That package of Keon, Kevin Huerter, 2 first-round picks to get Cam Johnson. Again, you think the Nets really strongly consider pulling the trigger this early?
Yeah, and I think that, again, from our perspective on Locked On Nets with Doug and I, our biggest thing is let's get Cam Johnson off the roster. This team needs to keep being bad, and they're losing games now, so it's a little bit different. I mentioned at the top, patience is something they can have right now. But to me, 2 first-round picks for Cam Johnson. He's had an incredible season. There's injury risk there with him as well. It's one of the things we hedge about. Move him before you have to worry that he's going to miss games. He's had that in his career. And that Ellis piece is certainly something where if you told me right now, there's a dozen deals that I would say yes to right now in this moment. How Brooklyn feels about it's a little bit different, but I like that package a lot. And I would love to hear officially Kings are making this offer. And now it's in Sean Marks and the Brooklyn Nets court to decide whether or not that's worthy of pulling the trigger in this moment. And that might just be an indication about where the market truly is for him and how eager teams are to put together significant packages.
Well, Adam, damn it, I've bled for this. I need to close this deal. I've bled for this here on Christmas Eve.
I came away relatively unscathed. I feel pretty good.
I look ridiculous. I'm putting this out for thousands of people to see. I don't care. Get me Cam freaking Johnson. I will bleed for it, and I'll look like an idiot and a buffoon in the podcast if this is what the Kings need to go out and do. Adam, I appreciate you taking the time on Christmas Eve morning to make this podcast happen, my friend. We'll see if it happens or not. I'm sure this conversation will pick up around the league as we get closer to the deadline, or the Kings will just say, screw the deadline. Let's just go and get this done now. I appreciate you, my man. Have a Merry Christmas, and we'll talk again soon.
Pleasure as always, man. Appreciate you. Basketball.